Welcome to the Empowering Story Podcast. This is a space where healing is allowed to take its own shape. Nothing here is rushed. Nothing is measured. We listen to what's already present and to what might be ready to move in its own time. Today we're exploring a topic that many people quietly carry but rarely talk about openly. What happens when someone who has gone through trauma begins to feel a pull to share their story? For many survivors, healing starts privately in therapy, in journaling, in rebuilding their lives. But sometimes there comes a moment when they realize that what they've lived through might help someone else feel less alone. The question then becomes, how do you share a story like that responsibly? How do you know when you're ready? Shawn Dorf has spent more than 2 decades working with survivors of trauma and helping them navigate that exact transition from private healing to what he calls an integrated voice. Today we'll explore how stories move, from fragments to meaning, and how survivors can contribute their voice without harming themselves in the process.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for being here. Today, I want to talk about something I have seen repeatedly in my work with trauma survivors over the past 2 decades. There comes a moment, often after years of therapy, personal work, and rebuilding life, when survivors feel a quiet pull, a sense that their story might help someone else, but that transition from private healing to public voice is much more complex than most people realize. Today, I want to explore that transition, why it is difficult, why many people get stuck in the middle of it, and how survivors can navigate it responsibly. The moment when someone feels called to share their story rarely arrives dramatically. It doesn't come with applause or certainty. It begins quietly, not as a demand for attention, not as a plea for validation. Instead, it often begins as a realization: what I lived through might help someone else feel less alone. This realization is deeply meaningful. But it also opens a very important question. How do you share responsibly without harming yourself in the process? In traditional trauma recovery, most therapeutic approaches focus on 2 essential things: processing what happened, understanding the patterns created by trauma. And this work is incredibly important. But something I noticed over time is that there is often a gap between insight and coherent expression. Many survivors can explain their trauma very clearly, but when they try to speak from within their own story, something collapses. The voice becomes hesitant. The narrative becomes fragmented. What I eventually realized is this: healing does not automatically produce voice. Voice is not just the result of healing. Often, voice becomes one of the mechanisms through which healing continues. To understand this, we have to briefly look at how trauma memories are stored. Trauma is often processed through the amygdala, the brain's alarm system. This part of the brain stores experiences in fragments: images, sounds, sensations, without a clear timeline. Meanwhile, the hippocampus, which normally organizes memory into narrative structure, becomes bypassed. So the brain holds the experience as something happening now, not something that happened then. This is why many survivors feel overwhelmed when trying to tell their story. The memory hasn't yet become a narrative. This is where many people unintentionally harm themselves. They feel ready to share publicly, but their nervous system cannot yet hold the story. So when they begin telling it, the body reacts with survival responses: freezing, dissociation, emotional flooding. The story comes out in bursts, and afterwards survivors often experience regret, shame, or renewed vulnerability. Instead of strengthening their voice, the experience can push them deeper into silence. I call this the retraumatization loop. One of the ways we recognize whether a story is integrated is by observing how it behaves. In an unintegrated narrative, a few patterns appear. The person speaks about their trauma as a detached observer. The story subtly changes depending on the audience. The emotional tone often feels flat or disconnected from the words. But when a story becomes integrated, something shifts. The survivor speaks with authorship. The narrative remains stable regardless of the audience, and the emotional content aligns naturally with the story. The body is often the most reliable indicator of readiness. When someone is not ready to share publicly, you see physical signs of contraction, shallow breathing, locked shoulders, a sudden loss of presence when certain parts of the story appear. But when integration begins to happen, the body behaves differently. Breathing becomes steady, posture opens. The person remains anchored in the present moment even while discussing the past. The emotion may still be present, but it moves through the body rather than overwhelming it. The first framework I developed to support this process is called the empowering story. And the most important rule in this phase is surprisingly simple. There is no audience. The first stage of voice integration happens in private spaces, through structured writing, through guided narrative development, through organizing experiences that once felt chaotic. This process moves traumatic memories from fragmented sensory experiences into structured narrative memory. The story gains sequence, boundaries, coherence. Writing is profoundly therapeutic even if no one else ever reads the words. When survivors begin structuring their story privately, something remarkable happens. They move from simply reacting to the past to actively shaping how the experience is understood. This shift is powerful. It marks the moment when someone begins to move from the subject of an event to the author of their life. Eventually, some survivors reach another turning point. They begin considering whether their story could help others. But when a story becomes public, the rules change. It is no longer just personal expression. It becomes relational. Your story now enters the lives of people who may be at very different stages of healing. So the question shifts from how do I express myself to how do I contribute responsibly? This is where the second framework comes in, Authority Bridge. Authority Bridge helps survivors transform personal experience into meaningful contribution. The key principle is this. Authority does not come from the trauma itself. It does not come from the graphic details of your worst day. Authority comes from the clarity that followed, the perspective gained, the integration achieved. This prevents trauma from becoming a commodity. The focus moves from exposure to insight. There is an important difference between exposure and contribution. Unintegrated exposure often focuses on emotional discharge and graphic details. The storyteller may feel overwhelmed. The audience may feel shocked or dysregulated, but integrated contribution works differently. The focus shifts toward patterns, lessons, meaning. The storyteller remains grounded, and the audience leaves with understanding rather than distress. When survivors share their stories responsibly, something powerful happens beyond the individual. Their voice gives language to experiences many people carry privately. It helps listeners recognize patterns in their own lives, and over time, these voices influence how society understands trauma. Families respond differently, professionals respond differently. Institutions respond differently. Responsible storytelling has the power to shift culture. But there is another side to this conversation. If we expect ethical storytelling from survivors, we must also expect ethical listening from audiences. We must ask ourselves difficult questions. Are we consuming trauma stories for entertainment? Are we amplifying stories of integration or stories of sensational exposure? And are we the kind of audience survivors deserve when they step forward to speak? So if you are someone who feels that quiet pull to share your story, start here. Do not start with a public post. Do not start with a blog. Sit down in a quiet space. Write your story for yourself. Watch your breath. Watch your body. Notice whether you can hold the narrative without becoming overwhelmed, because that quiet act of organizing the fragments is often the doorway from observer of the past to author of your life. And when that voice eventually emerges, it has the power to help others find their own.
What I appreciate about this conversation is the reminder that sharing a story is not a race, and it's not an obligation. For many survivors, the most important step is not speaking publicly, it's learning to hold their story with steadiness first. As Shawn Dorf reminded us today, the real shift happens when someone moves from simply reacting to their past to becoming the author of their life. And from that place, a voice can emerge that doesn't just express pain, it offers understanding. You joined us for a thoughtful conversation about healing, voice, and responsible storytelling. Thank you for listening to the Empowering Story Podcast. This space will be here when you return.
I am Shawn Dorf, and I want to thank you for being here. It's an honor to share this space with you. Until next time.